What's going on, guys? This is Rob. I think I'm going to go to the Ultra Music Festival. Actually, I'll probably do like Miami Music Week in March of 2019. And then I'm buying tickets for the Olympics in 2020 in Tokyo, Japan. I am excited for that. We're doing this shit, baby. Anyway, we are covering Heroes in Crisis, DC's Heroes in Crisis event. So this is really like a highly anticipated event. Here's one of the things to bear in mind, guys. For those of you guys who are new to DC Comics, whenever a story with the word crisis gets thrown out of there, people initially basically think that it's going to be like a cosmic event, because historically speaking, that's always been the case. Like when it comes to these major cosmic events, really it started with Crisis on Infinite Earths, 0 Hour Crisis in Time, then it became Infinite Crisis, then Final Crisis, but you also had Identity Crisis in there, which was the first time that you had an event like that wasn't cosmic in scope, which means to say it didn't impact the entire universe, like it wasn't being destroyed or something along those lines. And this is another one. This Heroes in Crisis doesn't deal with like the end of the world. It actually deals with like how superheroes function and what they do when they're basically suffering from PTSD. And this is cool because what this does is it initially picks up with Booster Gold, and there's really no better character to pick than like somebody like him that's dealing with, essentially like crisis level events. Because we know from the most recent story, for example, in Detective Comics, that Booster Gold had the idea to like save Batman, to basically like give him like the gift that Booster wanted to give Batman was like the perfect life. And so he went back in time and saved his parents from being killed, and that caused all kinds of problems because then it turned out that like, his parents ended up being killed anyway. And so it's kind of crazy when it comes to Bruce Wayne's whole idea and Booster Gold trying to do the right thing and so on and so forth. And so what this does is it initially switches over to Harley Quinn. Now, these are a series of interviews that DC kind of throws in there for the purpose of establishing what Sanctuary is. Now, we know by definition from the various stories that we've seen that Sanctuary is where the heroes go when they're dealing with a crisis of sorts, when the overwhelming aspect of being a hero becomes too much for them to bear. Sanctuary is where they're supposed to go to, but it's largely been ambiguous up to this point. We didn't really know what Sanctuary was about. We didn't know if it was spearheaded by some doctor somewhere. We didn't really know if it was just an organization where superheroes just sit down and talk to other superheroes, and that's it. There is no exterior source out there. There's no doctors or, no medicine or anything like that. We didn't really know how that worked. And so Harley Quinn's interview here, I guess her talking point really just kind of comes with the nature of her character and saying that like she's familiar with trauma because she used to be like a psychologist or somebody that worked with individuals' minds. But as she began to go crazy by virtue of the Joker, she's kind of started to switch to this idea of simply saying like these people out there with all these problems, like we should just like smash them with a sledgehammer. We should just like get rid of them, which is kind of an extreme point. But she also kind of has a breakdown towards the end. And that's the cool thing about this, because you see this sort of systematic adjustment to her character. That first she starts off confident, then she starts to use comedy as a defense mechanism, and then she starts to get to like the inner part of herself, and then she starts to cry. And so it's really one of these moments where it's like her character being broken down. And it's one of these things where like all she needed to do was just talk. And so what this does is it jumps back over to Booster Gold. And it's kind of funny because in this initial segment, there was this, this diner woman who was like, hey, there's another hero here. And Booster's like, that's not a hero, that's a villain. It's like, well, is it going to be a fight? And he's like, yes, it's going to be a fight. And it's kind of a cool thing because the way this unfolds, the way that like Tom King does this is so cool. It's like a fight that's building to anticipation, because you're talking about like Harley Quinn showing up here on the scene, and then it's just kind of like it's only a matter of time before they fight. Nobody else really seems to know. And even Booster Gold's aware this is going to turn into a fight. Harley Quinn's like, yeah, this is going to turn into a fight. And so it's really just kind of like, when do we strike? It's one of those classic sort of like Mexican standoff scenes, for example, from like the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly at the end, the Mexican standoff scene that lasted like 10 minutes before anybody started shooting anybody else. It was kind of weird. But at this point, we switch over to Superman, and we kind of get Superman just sort of arriving on the scene for a particular location. Now, again, the invocation of Superman in this story means that we're not dealing with like small beans here, that we're dealing with a pretty significant event. And so from here, we jump over to a guy named Blue Jay. Now, Blue Jay was a character who was originally introduced back in 1971 in Justice League of America, issue number 87, I'm pretty sure, and he was created by Michael Friedrich. Now, with regards to his character, he's kind of like Ant-Man in the sense that like he can shrink down. The difference is that he grows wings when he shrinks. But the funny thing about this is that he really just kind of says like I can control my power under normal circumstances. I'm very good at it, but as time has progressed, I seem to have lost control of my power. And so it's one of these things where it sort of feels like he has like a mental block in place. Now, Blue Jay is a pretty small time guy. I mean, he's not a big superhero, which is probably why you've never heard of him. He's small fish. But the cool thing about this is this kind of, Tom King telling us that the struggle of being a superhero isn't relegated to just the big guys, right? It's not like, the struggle of being Superman, the struggle of being Batman or Wonder Woman or Aquaman or something like that. It affects everybody in some form or fashion, big and small, which is actually a pretty cool idea. It's very akin to like Civil War from Marvel Comics, those of you guys who read that, where you basically had like everybody from the top, the big guys, Captain America, Iron Man, so on, all the way down to the bottom with like heroes for hire who were basically experiencing this rift in the superhero community. So it's kind of a cool concept. But from here, of course, the fight breaks out between Harley Quinn Quinn and Booster Gold. And it goes exactly as you would expect it to. I mean, for the most part, Booster's able to hold his own, but Harley Quinn's driven by absolute insanity and madness. And so when she starts lashing out, it's just kind of like, look, she's not going to stop here. I mean, she's just sort of lost her mind in the moment. And so what we end up doing is switching over to Batman, to Superman, and to Wonder Woman. Now, this is basically the Trinity that we're dealing with here. And that really seems to be what the story's boiling down to in a lot of ways. Can we also just say here, this is an amazing drawing. Clay Mann's the one who's doing like the art for the comic, and it looks amazing. Like, I would want this framed without the speech bubbles. Like, just the picture and no speech bubbles. Dude, I would love that. Like, have that and frame it in my house. It would be amazing. Anyway, with the Trinity of DC Comics, it's one of the important things. When you're talking about what's basically a whodunit murder mystery, the Trinity is oftentimes invoked more than anybody else. And the reason why we call them the Trinity is because they're kind of like the if there was such a thing, the 1-2-3 punch of DC Comics, really the comic book industry. Batman, of course, is the original anti-hero, Superman's the original superhero, and Wonder Woman is the original, like, you know, female empowered superhero. And so you take all three of these things, and it's like, these are the top three heroes that DC has. But them arriving at Sanctuary is predicated on the idea that someone's been going around and killing superheroes. That you basically end up having like this field full of bodies. You've got like, you know, some of whom are small time guys, some of whom are pretty big guys, but they've all basically been killed off. And so what we end up doing is having Superman enter into this house, only for us to find the two biggest players in the DC universe so far who have been killed off: Arsenal, Red Arrow, and the red-haired Wally West. And this is actually pretty big, because the question is, who the hell killed him? Like, it's you know, doing this is it's kind of crazy the way Tom King does this, because you could take it a couple different ways. The fact that it's just kind of like Wally and Arsenal are confirmed dead. Like, you would think it would be like a big dramatic moment when like you end up finding out they're dead, but it's just kind of like, yep, they're dead alongside everybody else, is kind of the feeling that you get. But what this also seems to point at is that this is indicative of a much bigger picture. There's something far more significant going on here. The deaths of these characters alongside all these other, you know, essentially small-time superheroes is really designed to say that their deaths are a byproduct of somebody out there being vengeful or what have you, but they're all superheroes. That at the end of the day, Wally West's Arsenal are really no different from all the other heroes who are out there, regardless of how small they are. They all fight crime, they all try to beat the bad guys, and they all struggle with being a superhero in their own way. That they all have their own desires, their own motivations, all the things that they regret and they suffer from. And so that's kind of the crazy scenario, is because what we're basically told here is that Sanctuary was set up by like Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman as a place for superheroes to deal with like the process of struggling, to deal with what it means to be a hero, to deal with like the emotional toll that it takes, which is pretty cool because that's something you never really see in DC Comics, or really in comic books as a whole. And in reality, that's just a holdover from the Silver Age. That's just a holdover from like 1950s comic books. That back then, back in the day, you had superheroes who fought the bad guys, and the superheroes beat the bad guys, and then the day was done, and that was it. And you might see some emotional struggle in their comics with regards to like the loss of something. For example, 1971, Peter Parker loses Gwen Stacy. 1972, I think it was, Eobard Thawne killed Iris West, and so, you know, Barry Allen went out and killed Eobard Thawne. I mean, you have like these moments where it kind of impacts the characters, but no one's ever really dealt with the idea of like, when the hero saves the day, who saves the hero? That's the question that none of the comic book companies ever really dealt with before. And so it's really, really cool to see this happen. And so it's almost kind of crushing, because it almost seems as though the entire basis behind Sanctuary is sort of all for naught. That these people were all brought here to find a place of solace, to find a place of comfort, to find a place of healing, and instead they found death. And so it's pretty sad to see. And so switching over to Harley and Booster Gold, you know, it's one of these things where they sort of have this conversation back and forth, and Booster Gold starts making allusions to the idea, and then actually makes kind of an outright statement that Harley Quinn was the one who killed everyone. And that's what's so crushing, is it's like, you went there and you killed every single person. And Harley Quinn says, no, I didn't kill anybody. I'm not the one who's responsible for everyone dying here. The person who's responsible for that, Booster, is you. And so basically we get this kind of transition to Booster Gold himself, where he's doing his interview, and he's saying like, I know exactly what you guys are about, which makes sense because he's from the future. But he's like, I know exactly what you guys are about. I know exactly what you guys do. You guys are an organization that essentially, like the overseers, the ones that help the superheroes get through their crises, are essentially robots built on Kryptonian tech that are a combination of Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman's personalities. And so Booster Gold simply says, yeah, like, I'm here to start talking, like, I'm here for help. And so it leaves things very, very ambiguous, because we don't really know what involvement Booster Gold had here. We don't really know if he outright killed everyone, if he set in motion a set of events that led to all their deaths, if it's some villain that Booster Gold set off by virtue of being there and talking to them them or something like that. We don't really know. And that's one of the cool things here is there's so many possibilities. It's entirely possible that this organization, Sanctuary, will eventually go awry. That we'll basically see what amounts to like a small-time future's end, where you end up having like these Kryptonian robots that take over the bodies of the superheroes and try to destroy the world. There's any number of things that could play out in this scenario. So it's pretty interesting, and it's actually pretty cool, and it works pretty well because, of course, it creates a lot of anticipation for the next issue. Okay, so we're covering part 2 of DC's Heroes in Crisis, and as I read through this, I started thinking about something, and I have a theory, and I'll run over that theory at the end of the video. I have an idea on who it is that's behind it. But anyway, so as we know with Heroes in Crisis so far, Wally West and Arsenal are like the 2 big heroes to die. I mean, we know that like the Heroes in Crisis event centers on the creation of something called Sanctuary, but Sanctuary was a place where heroes and even sometimes villains could go to like get the burden off their shoulders. It was a place for those who have powers where they could go and basically not keep all their emotions and thoughts bottled up and push them towards like a breaking point, because that's one thing to bear in mind. A lot of the heroes who are out there are masked heroes. They have dual identities. They really can't just like walk into a psychologist's office and say, hey doc, I got problems. I'm Batman, and I really struggle letting people know that because I'm walking this balance line of being like Batman and Bruce Wayne. By the way, please don't tell anybody, because all it would take is just like a judge with a court order to make that information come out. I mean, they'd have to give it up. And so because of this, they needed a place where heroes could go and talk. They could essentially, quote unquote, confess their sins, take that burden off their shoulders, and go back to being heroes again. The whole basis behind this was that someone somewhere went into Sanctuary and just killed a whole bunch of heroes, most of whom we hadn't even heard of, but a couple of big names were in there. You know, again, the death of Wally, the death of Red Arrow, of Arsenal, that was pretty big stuff. And so this picking up with Poison Ivy is intriguing here because Poison Ivy isn't so much a tried and true villain anymore as she is like kind of an anti-hero almost, that she's almost kind of reforming herself, you know, kind of going back to being a hero, so to speak, or at least becoming a hero, so to speak. And it's kind of a cool thing because you end up having Harley Quinn who jumps in the middle of all this. Now, this is very easy to write off, but it's actually very, very important because what this tells us is Harley Quinn was not supposed to be there, that she was at Sanctuary. We know that from the very first issue. She was at Sanctuary, but she wasn't supposed to be there. That because of the fact that she is in love, that her and Poison Ivy are a thing together, that she essentially just kind of snuck along. Not only that, we're not even really told how people are supposed to be there. That Poison Ivy's there, but we're not really told if you have to be invited or anything along those lines. Now, we'll also get another part of this puzzle, and Harley Quinn will kind of reveal how it was that Poison Ivy got there. But what ends up happening is Harley Quinn is essentially like, the way this is written, there are 2 things going on. 1, Booster Gold did it. 2, it looks like Harley Quinn did it and tricked Booster Gold into believing that he did it. That's kind of how this seems to unfold here. And Harley Quinn showing up at the lair of the Penguin is basically like, hey, look, I need a place to lie low for a while. And this is the other cool thing too. This is what I love about Clayman. A lot of times in comic books, for those of you guys who are new here, a lot of times in comic books, you'll see different villains drawn different ways. And sometimes you'll see them drawn in a way where it's like, that looks kind of ridiculous, right? Like you think of Oswald Cobblepot and you think of like the Penguin from like Batman the Animated Series, where he's more like to do, you know, he's more kind of pomp and circumstance, and he looks very put together and very like, you know, high end and very luxurious. That's kind of how his character comes across. But then you think about what the Penguin would actually be like in a city like Gotham City, and it's like, no, he would be an absolute disaster. And that's how Clayman draws him. And it's just kind of cool to see, you know, it's kind of interesting. And Harley Quinn basically tells him, look, like I have everybody coming after me right now. This is one of the most important parts of the story, the part that we switch to next. This is why Tom King is so cool. So Tom King, so the way this plays out is it's basically like it's this kind of discussion back and forth. Superman's like, Batman, you know. Batman's like, no, I don't know. And Wonder Woman's like, you're Batman. Of course you know what's going on here. Like, you know how this guy died. And Batman, you know, picked it up right off the bat. You know, you have this guy with indestructible skin. And the whole stance is, well, somebody put something in his mouth. I mean, if he's basically like Luke Cage, you can't really pierce his skin. Then somebody put something in his mouth and made him swallow it. And that's what ended up killing him. And it's kind of crazy because Batman figuring this out so fast, you know, leads to Superman and Wonder Woman asking questions of Batman himself. Like, you're the guy who prepares for everything. You're the guy who always has an ace up his sleeve. You're the guy who's always got secrets. Like, you use this place, like you can't tell us otherwise. You use this place to spy on people. Like, sure, this was a place where various people could go and they could seek out refuge and they could spill their darkest secrets so they wouldn't have to carry those around. But you built a back door so you could watch them, so you could see what it was that they do. Now, this is really like Superman and Wonder Woman just kind of throwing things out there and really like speculating more so than anything else. But it makes sense that Batman would do that. That was the whole basis of Tower of Babel. Tower of Babel established that Batman had these protocols on how to take down each member of the Justice League that he never told anybody about. The entire Justice League felt betrayed by Batman. And it's like these offhanded remarks. Well, no, you've probably got like kryptonite in your bat belt or something like that. And Batman's like, that's ridiculous. Of course I don't. It's these cool little exchanges, because what this does is it throws into sharp relief the idea that the Justice League doesn't fully trust Batman. But then we actually end up finding out Batman himself went to Sanctuary. Batman goes and sits down in the chair. And see this, God, Tom King, man, it's 9 panels long. And it tells you so much about Batman, right? Like he sits down in the chair and he says, I've trained partners to work with me and they've become my family. And then some of them have died. And that's it. That's all you get. And he just sits there and then he breaks down and cries and he says, I'm sorry. And it's just like, holy shit. It's one of the coolest things about, like, people who love Batman will tell you it's one of the coolest things about Batman. And maybe you have to be a Batman fan to really be able to grasp it, but it's like, this is the guy who never tells anybody anything. It's like this incredibly human side of Batman that you never get to see. But from this point forward, we pick up with Booster Gold. Now, Booster Gold is one of those guys who's as much goofy as anything else. Like, he's as much kind of a hassle as anything else. Because remember, he's basically a fraud, right? Like, he's a guy that never did anything with his life. He got time travel powers or time travel technology, jumped back to the 20th century and is like, yeah, in my time, I'm a hero. I'm Booster Gold. And just kind of like hoodwinked his way onto being part of like Justice League International and so on and so forth. But he's a guy who's more apt to screw things up than he is to do things right. And so we're actually going to kind of take things out of order a little bit, because what you end up doing is kind of jumping back and forth between Harley Quinn and Booster. We're actually going to kind of clear this up because the two are separate and they don't really cross over here. But what ends up happening is Booster sits around and says, okay, so like I'm probably the one who did this. Harley Quinn tells me I'm the one who did this, and I'm pretty sure I'm the one who did this. So I'm not really going to tell anybody that I'm the one who did this, but I'm going to solve the crime so that once people find out that I did it, well, I'm also the guy who solved everything. So they'll just say, hey, 6 in one hand, half dozen the other, and we'll go ahead and let it go. That's how Booster, that's like a classic Booster Gold thing. I screwed up really bad here, but I fixed what I screwed up. So that means everybody will forget that I screwed up in the first place. It's pretty classic of his character. And so when he goes through and he starts thinking, he's like, okay, well, there were bodies strewn everywhere. So of course, the first thing we have to do is figure out, who knows about these bodies. And he's like, if anybody in the world knows about bodies, it's Barry Allen. So I'll run to Barry Allen, I'll tell Barry Allen what's going on. Now keep in mind, Barry Allen doesn't know about Sanctuary, at least not to the extent that Booster Gold does. And for those of you guys who saw issue number 1, you guys, if you guys read that, you guys know what Barry Allen doesn't know. And so when you have Booster Gold show up here and start talking to Barry and say, hey man, look, I need you to tell me what's been going on. Like give me the information you did about the autopsies with the bodies of Sanctuary. Barry's like, what the hell are you talking about? The whole time he's fighting some villain. He's like, what the hell are you talking about? He's like, you remember what happened, man? Like, you know what happened? Like everybody at Sanctuary died. And like, Barry doesn't know. He had no clue that Wally West died. And the whole time, Skeets, the robot of Booster Gold, is like, dude, shut the hell up. Stop talking, because if you do, you're gonna spill the beans to Barry and he's gonna lose it. And the whole time that Booster's saying this, he's like, I'm pretty sure I'm the one who did it, And so just by connecting the simplest of dots, hey, Wally West is dead at Sanctuary and I'm pretty sure I'm the one who killed him. Barry races off. Like he's out in the time it takes for Booster to finish a sentence. Barry is there and back again. And he even asks Skeets, he's like, how long do you think it'll take him to analyze the bodies and get back? He's like, well, considering he's the fastest man alive, probably pretty quickly. And Barry comes running in with the wrath of God and just punches the hell out of Booster Gold while he's crying and just screaming, what did you do? It's so cool. This is why I love Tom King. Tom King's amazing at writing heroes. And when he writes this, it's the super emotional Barry Allen, because he basically had the beans spilled on him by a guy who didn't fully grasp the reality of the situation, who's just kind of flying by the seat of his pants being a superhero, and really seems to be very cavalier about throwing that information out there to Barry, which is kind of surprising considering how much Booster Gold knows about Barry. And so when that information's thrown out there, Barry is an emotional wreck and absolutely loses it. And who the hell knows what'll happen after this? And so picking up with Harley Quinn in turn is playing Go Fish with a penguin, which it's Harley Quinn. Nobody ever said she was sane. So Harley Quinn's playing Go Fish with a penguin. Enough said, which leads to the arrival of like Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. The Trinity basically busts into the scene and say, hey, look, we have questions, we need to talk. And Harley just like it's almost like she prepared for this, because she basically says, look, like it's crazy and there were bodies everywhere, and just kind of like losing her mind, and it's just, oh my God, it was so insane. And it was just this overwhelming thing, and makes her way up to Wonder Woman, which is a smart move, because Wonder Woman would be more likely to forgive Harley Quinn than Batman or Superman, because remember, Wonder Woman sees the various female superheroes out there as her sisters. So she's not going to just automatically lash out. She's going to listen first. But this is the cool thing. Harley Quinn makes her way up to Wonder Woman, and when she does, she snatches the lasso of truth, steals it off of Wonder Woman, and in turn uses her acrobatics, jumps out of the way, knocks Wonder Woman out, and then lashes it around Batman, takes him hostage. And this is cool because Harley Quinn knows Batman. Like, she knows how Batman functions. When she wraps it around him, she literally asks the question, is there anything that you have on you right now that can be used against the Justice League? And Batman's response is, like Superman's like, no, he doesn't. He told me he doesn't. Wonder Woman's like, no, this is, nobody wants to believe it. Batman's response, there's kryptonite in my bat belt. It's in the third pouch on the left, and it's in a lead container. Bam. Batman's a liar, lied to Superman right to his face. And Wonder Woman had to have suspected it because she's not in denial. She's not like, oh my God, really? Did you do this? She's just kind of like, Batman, yet again, more lies, more trickery from the Dark Knight. And in turn, like she grabs the kryptonite, breaks it out, uses it as a way to distract Superman and just races off and she's gone. Wonder Woman in turn, of course, turns to Superman, turns to Batman to tend to him to make sure they're okay because she would take the more logical stance and say there'll be time to catch up to her later, which gives Harley Quinn the out that she needs. But this is yet another instance where Batman is lying to the Justice League, lying to his friends, the same thing as always. Batman lying, Batman being deceitful, and Superman kind of brushes it off in the moment, but it's also one of these things where it's like, I guess it's kind of expected, but like the statements he makes here, it's like, man, she's good, she's as good as you are, Batman. She's as good as you at tricking people, lying to people. It's kind of crazy because Wonder Woman's just like, this is not the time for this. This is not the time to get into a pissing contest and to argue and bicker and so on and so forth. And then suddenly Superman picks up on what's going on, that Barry Allen has Booster Gold, that Barry Allen has taken Booster Gold, which means Barry Allen now knows what's going on. And so this is when you basically pick up with Harley Quinn when she's on the top of a bridge in Gotham and she starts talking about Sanctuary. And this is a cool thing because what she says here is she says, I shouldn't have done all the things that I've done. Like there's so many things that I shouldn't have done. She says, I shouldn't have let anyone hurt you. I shouldn't have followed you to Sanctuary. So like, I should not have let anyone kill you, Poison Ivy. I shouldn't have told you about Sanctuary. I shouldn't have loved you. I shouldn't have met you. I shouldn't have done all the things that led up to this moment, basically. That Poison Ivy was told about Sanctuary. And so it seems as though Sanctuary had an open doors policy. That you didn't have to be invited, that it wasn't only a limited number of people. It was for anyone, which lives up to the charter of Sanctuary as it had been explained so far. Anybody can come in here and anybody can confess their sins. That's what this place is for. And so it's kind of nuts because then you switch over to the Daily Planet and there's this package that came in for Lois Lane. Like it's basically written by Arsenal saying, here's the whole basis behind Sanctuary. Here's what this whole place is about. Here's what we do here. Here's how all this stuff works. And if any of us should die here, just know that it was done by the Puddlers, or at least the package itself was signed by the Puddlers. And so it's just kind of like, wow. I mean, like there's these hidden hands behind all this. And so this is when things get really, really, really crazy because because here's the thing you have to remember, all these confessions are being made to computer systems. And if these confessions are being made to computers, then it stands to reason that all the information would be deleted. That's what Batman says in the story. No. This whole thing is there. People confess their sins in 24 hours. It's deleted. So you can say anything you want to. What you'd have here is you have Superman who sits down and says, I'm Superman. I'm Clark Kent. I was raised as the Kents in Smallville, and then I learned my own history. I learned the fact that I come from Krypton, that in the presence of a yellow sun, that I have what amount to basically godly powers, and that I lead a dual identity. Sometimes I don't really know who I am. Sometimes I don't know if I'm really Clark Kent or if I'm really Superman. And that's why I made the identity so similar to each other by just taking off these glasses and putting them back on, because if I made them too extreme, I would get lost in my identities. I wouldn't know who I actually was. But it's something that he fears. It's something that he's afraid of, that he'll lose his way. But Superman just confessed his identity to a recording device that could very well have been infiltrated and could very well have been taken over. Now, to what happens with this recording device, I have no real idea. I mean, it'll probably come out that their identities are revealed to the world and so on and so forth. But in terms of who it was that killed everyone, in reality, if I'm a betting man, I would say this is being done by Psychopirate. Because from what we gather, we don't know what happened to Psychopirate. I mean, we know, but we don't really know. The last time we saw Psychopirate was during Tom King's Batman run in the I Am Suicide story, and like Psychopirate was serving alongside Bane, and then Psychopirate was taken by Batman in order to undo the damage that was done to Gotham Girl. But then like that's it. Like as far as we're aware, I mean, he wasn't killed. He's not dead. He's just out there somewhere. And it's entirely possible that if Batman sits down and Batman says, let's create Sanctuary, then Batman would have to answer the question, what do we do with those who don't want to talk? Like those who come here, but then they get hesitant and they walk away. How do we get them to talk? And Psychopirate can do that. He manipulates the emotions of others. But it makes perfect sense to me that Psychopirate is the man standing on the other side of these recording devices. The recording devices are just recording devices. But who knows? But like, I feel like Psychopirate would have a hand in all this. That he would be what amounts to the therapist, the person manipulating, emotionally manipulating people into letting all their emotions out. Either that or it would be like Psychopirate and Hugo Strange, who were like, Hugo Strange is in the shadows behind the scene manipulating Psychopirate or controlling Psychopirate, telling him what to do. Psychopirate does that and no one knows that Hugo Strange is behind it all. There's a lot of things that could be going on here. And the only reason why I even think about Hugo Strange is I think about that old story from Batman, the old Steve Englehart run, which they did in Batman the Animated Series, where Hugo Strange was basically learning people's like darkest secrets and then blackmailing them into like paying him money or doing him political favors. Again, there's any number of things that could go on here. Okay, so getting into Heroes in Crisis Part 3, what I want to do here is I want to kind of switch up how we would normally record this, which is to say, normally we would go through the way the book's written and kind of call it a day. The issue with this is that the way that Tom King does this is it's literally like the first page is Lagoon Boy, the second page is Wally West, the third page is like Booster Gold, and then it goes back to Lagoon Boy, then it goes back to Wally, then it goes back to Booster Gold. And so what it does is it would create all kinds of weird issues when we're trying to record this. And so what we're going to do is we're going to split it in segments, because really it focuses on these three characters, on Wally, Booster, and Lagoon Boy. And the first person I want to focus on here is the segment about Lagoon Boy's character. Now, as he's going through here, he's basically being shot with a laser consistently. But remember, the nature of Sanctuary is that it's designed to be a place of healing, a place for people to kind of move on past whatever struggles they have and then go back to being a hero. You know, it's kind of like a rehab clinic to a degree, but more like a trauma clinic. Now, the important thing about this is that with Lagoon Boy seeking this out on himself, initially we didn't really know why this was happening, but then Tom King goes through and kind of gives us an explanation about Lagoon Boy and actually draws on former instances of his character. And so to sort of wind the clock back a little bit, you know, what Lagoon Boy tells us here is that as he's doing this, what he's doing is hearing the screams of various, you know, members of the Titans that he had fought alongside and who were severely injured in a variety of different ways. You know, for example, one of the characters, Power Boy, was injured. He hears his screams in his mind. He hears the screams of like a character named Barda. What this does is it kind of goes back to the origin of Lagoon Boy and then the attempts of DC to like branch off the Teen Titans title. Wind the clock back to 1998, there was a guy named Eric Larson who took over the Aquaman series. Now, Eric Larson's Aquaman run was written after Peter David, and a lot of Aquaman fans hated the Eric Larson run. But in reality, it wasn't really Eric Larson's fault, right? Like it was more of like an editorial mandate, which is to say that under Peter David, the writing of Aquaman was pretty dark and it was pretty heavy-handed. And so coming out of that, it was make Aquaman lighter. And the result was that in a lot of ways, the run of Eric Larson came off as kind of campy. Now, Lagoon Boy was introduced in issue number 50, and the idea was to form a group that was called the Surface Lovers. I think it was what it was called. But basically it was Lagoon Boy and a couple other people who essentially took to kind of like going against Atlantean ways and then just kind of being more of like a bridge, kind of serving the role as Aquaman, where they were kind of like a bridge between the surface world and Atlantis. Of course, didn't take too well with the Atlantean people, but for Lagoon Boy himself, he actually has no origin in DC Comics. As far as I'm aware, he was just there one day. And the reason why no origin was given, if I were a betting man, I would say is because the run of Eric Larson wasn't very well received, which means that Lagoon Boy was not very well received. Now that goes into the Teen Titans special, which I wanted to say was written by Chuck Dixon, although I could be wrong, but it was Teen Titans East. And Teen Titans East was designed to take the normal Teen Titans team and then create like a secondary team that would basically function in a different capacity, but would still follow the Teen Titans brand, would still have teenage superheroes. But basically you had this new Teen Titans team that was formed, and then like right off the bat, they go against the kids of Trigon who basically wreck them all. And that's the experience that Lagoon Boy's talking about when he talks about hearing their screams and different things like that, being shot with a laser, and so on and so forth. That's what he's enduring here. He's constantly doing it to himself. And the reason why is because with a laser passed through him and put him in a comatose state, so on and so forth, his idea is if he endures being shot enough times, eventually it won't affect him anymore. And so the screams will stop in his head. That's the kind of treatment he's going with here. Now, that's the important thing about Sanctuary, is Sanctuary does not really seem to have any true doctors, which is to say, it's not as though they go in there and then they're diagnosed and then they say, here's what you need to do to fix your problem. Instead, they go in there and they're just kind of left to their own devices and they stay however long they need to stay until that trauma is essentially remedied, which, as you guys can imagine, can cause all kinds of different problems. And that's what Lagoon Boy endures, is constantly being shot with lasers. Now, of course, there comes a point where he simply says, stop, I'll come back tomorrow and we'll continue the process again. But that's basically what he's doing, is literally injuring himself under the idea that eventually he'll become immune to it, or it won't faze him anymore, it won't bother him anymore. And the belief is that when that time comes, he won't have to worry about the voices in his head or anything like that. Now, switching over to Wally West, things are a lot more straightforward here. One of the things to bear in mind when it comes to classic Wally West is that he's been stuck in the Speed Force all this time. When the events of New 52 happened and everything was rebooted and classic Wally West was nowhere to be found, when Rebirth started, DC answered the question of where's classic Wally West been by saying he's been stuck in the Speed Force, and Barry Allen was finally able to bring him out by remembering him. And so ever since then, classic Wally has been getting his memories back slowly and steadily, and that means he's been learning about his children, Jai and Iris. He's been learning about Linda Park, the fact that they were married. But that's not the case now. By whatever manner and whatever means, presumably due to the actions of Dr. Manhattan, everything Wally West knows has been changed. And so where you can't just run to Linda Park and say, hey, we're married and we have kids, and expect her to kind of be on board like, oh, that makes sense. That's not going to happen. And so what he's been doing here is basically trying to like figure out, or at least try to find some way to kind of cope with his existing environment. And so what we end up finding out is that what he's been doing is basically recreating his life inside of Sanctuary, where he has Linda Park who runs out to greet him, where he has his kids, Jai and Iris. He has the life he always wanted. And so one of the cool cool things is that he and his kids, the Tornado Twins, actually end up facing off against Captain Cold. And that's kind of like reliving the memories, reliving the way things used to be. Now, in reality, this is a good way of coping with things, but I feel like what Tom King is hitting at here is that this can be a very, very dangerous thing. And the reason why is because there is such a thing as getting lost. In any scenario that we're in, there's only ever two circumstances that we face: the reality as things are and the way we would like them to be. And oftentimes, if we allow ourselves to get stuck in the way that we would like them to be, we get trapped there, we never fully recover. Like we never come back from there, right? Because I mean, like, why would you? It's like Star Trek, the Star Trek Generations, right? While the movie was terrible, they had this really, really cool concept called the ribbon. And basically, if it passed over you, you were yanked into a place called the Nexus. And you essentially repeated the best moments of your life, presumably for all eternity, or at least for however long your body held out. But if you were given the opportunity to relive the best moments of your life, why wouldn't you take that opportunity? And if you were given that opportunity and you did take it, what's to say you wouldn't get lost? And that's the issue with Wally West here. Wally West is living in a life that doesn't exist anymore. And living in this life that doesn't exist anymore, he won't want to leave, or at least it seems like he won't want to leave. And so in response to that, how can you yank somebody from perfection? How can you yank somebody from absolute tried and true happiness? This is the life he always wanted. He has his wife, he has his kids, he has the things that he lost that he wants back so dear. But the problem is that he's not facing the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation is that his family's basically gone. And maybe it's one of these things where if it had been allowed to play out, that Tom King would have written it out in such a way to where Wally West would have just been able to say goodbye. I have to let you go. Now remember, Wally was told by Professor Zoom, he was told, hey, like, your kids are alive. Like, your kids are alive and they exist out there somewhere. So Wally is most likely on the hunt for them, or will be on the hunt for them at some point in time. But it's one of the interesting things, because the way this is written, it almost seems to kind of ignore that idea, right? Like, it almost seems to kind of ignore the notion that Wally's aware of his children's true existence, because then the question would be, if he does know they exist, why isn't he out finding them? So again, these little tidbits are kind of, a little bit of conflict going on there, but nothing outrageous. It's just kind of Wally living this life that ultimately it doesn't seem like he'll want to let go of. Now for Booster Gold, his segment of the story is a lot more straightforward. He's a guy trying to figure out what in the heck is going on. But here's the issue with this. So Booster Gold has always had two parts to himself, right? Like, there's the Booster Gold as the hero and the Booster Gold who's a liar. The Booster Gold as he exists, like, he's basically a con man, right? Like, he took technology from the future, traveled to the past, and is like, I'm the greatest hero in the future, and then just kind of purported that idea in the present day. The issue with that is that Booster's been living with that lie the entire time. And so that's kind of the thing. Like when he goes through, we kind of get this explanation of what's going on with regards to the nature of Sanctuary, in the sense that when this issue first opened up and Booster Gold first arrived at Sanctuary, he was met by basically what appeared to be Ma and Pa Kent and Lana Lang. Now, the inclusion of them is not accidental. Sanctuary itself was built using the technology of Superman, the ingenuity of Batman, and the hope of Wonder Woman. But when it comes to the character of Ma and Pa Kent and Lana Lang, they hold a very particular place in DC Comics, not just with Superman, but with DC Comics as a whole. And what I mean by that is that Jonathan and Martha Kent kind of represent the greater wisdom, the people who kind of impose these pearls of wisdom on us. That was the nature of Jonathan and Martha Kent, helping Superman become more than just a guy with powers and become something that represented hope for humanity. Lana Lang plays a very important role because she was the first person to recognize or to learn the powers of Superman and taught him how to use them. So she was very much kind of like a younger guiding hand for Clark Kent, as opposed to the pearls of wisdom that were instilled on him by Jonathan and Martha Kent. But with the nature of Sanctuary itself, what it does is it basically changes your environment using Kryptonian crystals, and then allows you to use whatever you need to do in order to get past things. For Booster Gold, he's facing himself. That Booster himself has a lot of unresolved issues here. Now, these aren't really delved into too far in this. It's just kind of like, hey, basically everything you do screws up. Why? Well, because you're not doing it for good reasons. You're doing it because you're trying to prove that you're an actual hero. And that's the nature of Booster. And those are those two diametrically opposing views that his character represents. On one half, you have Booster Gold who wants to be the hero, and on the other half, you have Booster Gold doing everything to show he's a hero, when in reality, he's not. He's a con man. He doesn't think like a good guy. He thinks like, how can I prove that I'm a hero by doing this? He's basically trying to fix what's not broken. And so what that does is it creates all kinds of problems for his character. Now, before any of this goes on, before we really get any, huge explanation on what's happening with these guys, suddenly alarms start going off. And when they do, Lagoon Boy's killed. He's one of the people that's killed. Wally races out only to find that, of course, Red Arrow, Arsenal, whatever you want to call him, Roy Harper, is basically dead. And the person overlooking it all is Harley Quinn. And Harley Quinn cracks Wally West over the head with a mallet and kills Wally West. And so it's kind of like, okay, well then Harley Quinn, of course, was the one who killed Wally, presumably is the one who seems to have killed everybody else. It's kind of intriguing and it's kind of interesting because we don't really know exactly what direction things are going. And it's one of these scenarios where it's kind of like vantage point, right? Like all these things are happening, but we're looking at it from different perspectives, trying to figure out who's ultimately responsible for the death of all these characters. Okay, so picking up with Heroes in Crisis Part 4, God, we're kind of behind. We need to get caught up. Like, I let everybody in the comic book YouTube scene get ahead of me. Now I have to crush them all with my uploads. Okay, so getting into Heroes in Crisis Part 4. So this is kind of cool because one of the things to bear in mind, again, kind of getting back into this Heroes in Crisis thing, this is designed to show the side of the superheroes that we don't see, right? So like, it's really similar to like Civil War. Like, for those of you guys who never read Marvel Civil War, of course, it was a big calamity, the superheroes versus superheroes. But what made it cool was you saw like small little moments where there were different heroes like Tigra who were like, I cannot afford to be a college kid and a superhero at the same time with my identity out there in the world. And if I have to choose one, I'll choose to go to college. And so like, they would quit. And so it was like these small little things. And that's what's cool about Heroes in Crisis. Initially, this picks up with like Tempest, who's basically drunk in a bar and just kind of rambling on and going on about nonsense. It's not designed to really say like he's endured like a huge shock or anything like that. It's designed to show these heroes at their worst, when they're at their lowest points. Because what this is designed to do, what the whole concept of Hero in Crisis is designed to do, is to humanize the heroes even more than they already are. To basically say like, whenever you go and buy a Batman book, all you see is Batman fighting one villain after another. But what happens between the panels? Like, what happens between these issues? What's Tempest doing? What's Superman doing? What's Batman doing? What are they doing between these conflicts? How are they coping with like all these major events that are going on and so on and so forth? That's what it's designed to focus on. And that's why it's so cool, because what we end up doing here is we switch over to Booster Gold. Now remember, Booster Gold was the person who was basically on the scene when like the whole event of really like the deaths of all these superheroes went on during Sanctuary. You know, he woke up, Harley Quinn was there, but as far as everybody's aware, they believe that Booster Gold was the one to do it. And so what he ends up doing is basically taking this kind of lasso test where one woman puts a lasso around his hands and where he basically divulges everything he saw. And what he says really kind of, it's really cool for Tom King to do this because it kind of catches us up. But what he says is basically like, I was there, I made a confession just like everybody else, and then like all hell broke loose. And that's basically it. Like, as far as I know, Harley Quinn was the one who did it because like I came out there and like everybody was dead. Harley Quinn had this bleeding mallet and then she started hitting me with it, and then I woke up later on. And that's it. That's all he really knows. I mean, that's one of the things to bear in mind, is that when it comes to Booster Gold, he's kind of the perfect culprit to blame if you're the person who committed all these acts. Because remember, Booster's entire superhero antics are shrouded in fraud. He's a guy from the future who dreamed of being a superhero after being basically a nobody. He stole a whole bunch of technology from a museum. He traveled back to the present day and said, I'm a hero from the future. Once that was found out, he was just kind of like, okay, whatever. This guy's not really much of a hero at all, but he still kind of went along and did various hero antics. But he's really just kind of like the class clown, the goofball, the one who's more inclined to screw things up than to get things right. And so if you're a person who's going to commit a crime, no one sees what it is that you've done, and Booster Gold happens to be there, he's the perfect guy to blame. And so this is when the plot thickens, because what we do here is we switch over to Lois Lane speaking with Superman, talking to Clark Kent. And what she basically reveals here is that she's been getting information. She's basically been getting the video files, these confessions that people have been making. They've been sent directly to her. Now, she of course is kind of operating under the assumption that if they've been sent to her, they've been sent to other people. But remember, Lois Lane is a reporter. And so for her, it's the story that really seems to count. And that's one of the kind of things that Tom King really draws here, is he almost kind of draws this idea that for Lois Lane, it's the story first and then everything else second. But it's not necessarily that way, because the case she makes here is someone's going to drop this scoop. My source gave me these files. The implication seems to be that somebody else or other people have the files or could get the files besides her source, or at the very least, her source got the files in such a way to where they could be leaked to the public. And so her idea is, we have to make this story public and we have to make it fast, because if we don't, somebody else will do it before I do, and they won't be unbiased. They'll put a slant on it, and it'll be things like, are superheroes trustworthy? Are superheroes good guys? They'll do it in such a way to where it has a political leaning, where I, as Lois Lane, can do it in the most non-slant way possible. And so that's why it's one of the cool things that kind of goes on here, is because it's the question of, does Lois Lane have a moral obligation to publish the story, given its very nature and the fact that if somebody else does it, they'll do it in what could be a negative way. It's possible they could do it in a positive way. But remember, when it comes to the superheroes in DC Comics, there's a lot of negative slant towards them. They're not inherently bad, and it's not like society as a whole views them as a negative, but it's one of these things where the news exists to sell itself. And so if the news can be sold in such a way to where it can be done in a negative fashion and people will eat it up more likely than they would be if it were done in a positive fashion, then that's what they will do. And so again, it's kind of a funny scenario, because then what you end up doing is picking up with Batgirl and Harley Quinn, and the two of them literally just start immediately coming to blows. Now, there's a couple reasons for this. One, because it's Harley Quinn and Batgirl, and two, because Harley Quinn's basically on the run here. That seems to be the indication throughout this whole story, and she's essentially like fleeing for her life, because for those who have been investigating this whole thing and those who are looking past Booster Gold as the immediate suspect, that makes Harley Quinn Quinn public enemy number one. It makes her the number one suspect, so she was quite literally caught with blood on her hands with the whole thing that was going on in Sanctuary. And so with Batgirl showing up here, of course, the kind of discussion is, look, I'm not really here to bust you or anything. Like, I'm here to help you. I'm here to try to figure out what's going on, so on and so forth. And so the two of them kind of calm down and sort of hug and then go from there. But it's kind of interesting here because what this ends up doing is sort of switching over to Blue Beetle. And this is kind of a cool little thing here because remember, Blue Beetle and Booster Gold are two peas in a pod. They're the best of friends. And one of the things that really gets talked about here with Blue Beetle is that exact thing. When Ted Kord is going through here and he's talking about these different concepts, one of the things that he hits on is his friendship with Booster Gold. And that's why he says, like, I put Booster Gold first. Like, I trust Booster Gold. If he says he didn't do it, then I believe him. But it's a very important thing here because as he goes through and kind of talks, he talks about the nature of what it means to be a hero, right? Like, you're effectively surrounded by death and suffering all the time. That's the nature of what it means to be a superhero, is that heroes, various heroes die all the time. And that's why this story is so cool, is because DC Comics on the whole largely focuses on like the popular heroes, the cool kids table. That's basically DC. You don't really see what goes on in like the band geek table or like the comic book nerd table. You don't really see what goes on those little tables over there. But we're kind of left to assume that they're heroes, they do things, and some stuff happens and they sort of go about their business and they go to bed and all that kind of good stuff. But you don't really hear their story. You don't see which one of them die. You don't see which one of them lose friends. You never really learn about that. With Blue Beetle here, he's kind of like, that happens all the time. Like in that table over there, they've lost 4 or 5 guys in the last 3 weeks. You look at that table over there, well, they've lost 10 guys in the last year, but you never hear that story. But when he says he's a superhero, he's sitting at the tables just like everybody else, surrounded by all these different tables of all these different heroes. Some come and some go, and it's just the nature of the beast. And it's kind of like, how do you get past that? How do you learn to cope with it? And the response he gives is, it's just the way it goes. It's just the nature of the beast, how this whole thing happens. And so that's why he says, when things get hard and things get tough, Booster Gold is the one that he goes to. And that's why it's kind of cool, because for all the benefit that Kord Industries does in terms of providing a kind of financial back end to the building of Sanctuary, to a lot of the different things that go on, at the end of the day, Booster Gold and really Blue Beetle are still kind of considered to be outliers. They're heroes, but they're not really heroes. You know what I mean? Like, they're not really part of the Justice League. Like, they're there, but when people say, oh my God, we got to get a hold of the Justice League, nobody thinks of Blue Beetle. Nobody thinks of Booster Gold. They're just kind of heroes who were there, and like, they serve a purpose occasionally. Even in the real world, reading comic books, it's kind of an on-running joke. The most significant moment in Ted Kord's life was getting shot in the head. Like, I mean, it's just one of those things that you kind of get when it comes to comics, is it just sort of the guys who were down there. And so that's why things get sort of crazy, is because what happens here is we basically pick up with Superman when he's speaking directly with Batman and Wonder Woman. Now remember, they're the ones who made Sanctuary, right? Like, Sanctuary uses the technology of Superman in terms of, the available technologies and the Fortress of Solitude that can create like holograms, illusions, different things like that. So it uses that technology with regards to creating like holograms and so on, coping mechanisms, different things like that. It uses the ingenuity and the money of Batman in terms of how to pull it all together. And of course, it's all based on the empathy of Wonder Woman and her ability to like understand other people's pain. So between the Trinity, they effectively built Sanctuary. And so it makes sense that with things popping off, the three of them are talking. But Superman shows up here and says, look, there's something that I have to make you guys aware of. And when the question is what, the response is, Lois Lane is going to go live with the story about Sanctuary. She has all the various data logs. Now, of course, Batman's response is, that's not possible. They should all be gone and deleted. And remember, that makes sense, because what you're talking about here are confessions of superheroes, and no one knows what they're going to say. When Wonder Woman did her confession, she talked about killing Maxwell Lord. When Superman did his confession, he talked about dying. When Batman did his confession, he talked about having his back broken by Bane. These are the innermost thoughts of people of various superheroes being recorded on these data logs. Things they would never share with the world. Things they don't want anybody else to know. Their deepest, darkest desires, their deepest, darkest confessions, all are being made on these data log tapes. And that's why they're supposed to be deleted almost right off the bat, so that nobody can ever get their hands on them. But what seems to have happened here is, by one means or another, someone got their hands on all these different videotapes. And when the question is asked, when is Lois going live with the story, Superman says, well, that's why I'm telling you, it went live 33 seconds ago. And so it's just like, wow. So basically, like, all this information is now out there about the superhero community. All these confessions are now out there. It's literally throwing everything out there into the world and taking all the deepest, darkest secrets, especially with Batman. When Batman sits down and says, like, I've had a desire to kill heroes before. Like, I've had a desire to eliminate them, to destroy them, to wipe them off the face of the earth, but I can't do that because it goes against everything I stand for. Like, with those confessions being made and thrown out there, they're available for the world to see, which is going to fundamentally change how the world views superheroes. Okay, so continuing on with Heroes in Crisis Part 5, this really deals more with like the aftermath, and it's almost kind of like Superman's appeal to humanity. Now, there are a couple things that go on here, but again, there's only really like two big takeaways from all this. There's only really like two big moments from this whole thing. But I like the way that this is done because I feel like Tom King uses the nature of Superman so exceedingly well. So when it comes to Superman in DC Comics, this is a very important thing to remember here. Superman is a contextual character, and what that means is that people's enjoyment of Superman comics is relative to how he's written. And while you would normally say that about a bunch of other heroes, for the most part, you can really get away with a lot of things with a lot of different heroes. With Batman, you can tell really dark and gritty stories like Batman Endgame, and you can even go back to Steve Englehart where the Joker was like dark and comedic. You can go into those different aspects. Teen Titans, you can do a lot of teenage drama, or you could do happier stories. There's a lot of shifting around that goes there. But for Superman, he's not really that flexible. And the reason why is because of how long he's been around and what he stands for. Mark Waid did this really good interview years ago. This was probably, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. And what he said was the reason why Superman is so popular, why he stands the test of time, is because he's everything to everyone. Like every generation, Superman is whatever that generation needs him to be. So like during the 60s when it was all anti-Vietnam War and the hippie movement was at the height of its popularity, Superman was kind of a reflection of that. He was anti-war. It was always that way. It's always been that way with his character. That's kind of how he maintains his relevance. And so one of the worst things you can do with Superman is try to kind of like force him into a role that's just not very appealing, that's not really in the nature of its character. But Tom King does that exceedingly well. And so one of the funny things about this is that it initially picks up with like the really kind of the aftermath of this article published by Lois Lane being sent out to the world, basically showing like all these revelations and all these statements and all these admissions and different things like that were all brought to bear by the various superheroes who were out there making their admissions within the confines of Sanctuary. And so in response to this, Superman immediately addresses the crowd. And there's a reason why it's Superman. The in-universe landscape in DC Comics is Superman's the most respected superhero on the planet, right? Like his word is beyond contestation. That's the nature of his character. That's the nature of how he functions within, on Earth within DC Comics. Is it's like the one guy you don't question. And it's the one hero that like everyone has respect for. The villains respect him, the heroes respect him. Even if they don't like him, even if they fight him all the time, they still respect him. And so it makes sense to parade him out and be the one that basically says things. Because for the most part, when you're Superman, shy of somebody running up on you with kryptonite or like Doomsday, not very many people out there are going to be able to like challenge you. I mean, the number of people who can legitimately challenge Superman on Earth, you can probably count on one hand. And so with that being the case, it's not really like Superman is much of a challenge. And so there's not really a whole lot for him to lose. And so he's just kind of out there talking to everybody. And what he basically says is that he's prepared a statement for this whole thing. And what he essentially says here is that like the basis behind Sanctuary is that one, he acknowledges there was an incident that a bunch of metahumans were killed and that the prime suspects here are Harley Quinn and Booster Gold. Of course, if you guys are curious about that, feel free to watch the previous videos. But in response to this, what he basically does, while you have like Booster Gold and Blue Beetle essentially like investigating the whole crime scene, which we'll talk more about that here in a minute, Superman kind of makes this statement and basically says the whole basis behind Sanctuary was that it was supposed to be a place where heroes can go to essentially recoup from all the things they've experienced. And it's basically Superman saying like, these are just people. And that's kind of the cool thing about it is because from the way that comic books are traditionally written and the way the superheroes are traditionally done, they almost seem like gods among men. And for the average person walking around, it'd be difficult to differentiate between the two. And it's kind of a funny thing because even Batman made that case in the story that Tom King wrote, where you had Batman serving jury duty and he was questioning, Bruce Wayne was questioning the nature of the Batman concept and said that people call Batman God because Batman saves them where God does not. And so if that's the case, then they have to consider Batman God, because if that's not true, then how do you justify a man that saves him? It was this really cool introspective look at the character. But on the whole, across the board, it's usually been done in such a way that the various superheroes save the world from multiple threats. And humanity, whether they want to admit it or not, looks to those superheroes to save them, and oftentimes forgets the idea that they are just people. That more often than not, with the exception of Superman, Martian Manhunter, maybe one or two other people, that they were born on Earth, and they were born to parents, and their parents raised them to become productive members of society, and they were just trying to make their way in the world as best as they possibly can. And people forget that. People look at that and they just say like, you're a superhero, your job is to save me. And if you don't save me, it means you didn't do your job. And the idea behind this is to say like, it was a place of recovery. It was a place of respite. It was a place for these people, for these heroes to go and to basically recover from the various experiences they've had, because they can't bring that to your attention. And they can't bring that to your attention because that shows weakness. Superman can't get up there and basically start crying and showing all manner, because people will lose faith in him. If you show people that God can bleed, they will lose faith in him. Like that's the idea behind it, is that like if Superman or one of these metahumans got up there and started crying or started showing vulnerability or emotion, that ultimately people would begin to lose faith in them. Well, if they're this weak of a person, how can we rely on them to save us? How can we rely on them to be there when the times are the absolute toughest? And so with that being the case, they needed a private place where they could go to. They could spill their darkest secrets. They could tell everything that they ever wanted to get off their chest, and it would immediately be deleted. It would immediately be removed, and that would never really be the case anymore. It's kind of an interesting thing because Superman even asked that question. He says, if this is a place that people went to, if this is a place that they went to in order to find some measure of respite, some measure of solace, does that mean that they are now unworthy because of the fact that they are human? They do need to find some way to let all this steam off because they're not gods walking on Earth. They're just people who happen to have fantastic powers. Does that somehow make them unworthy? Does it make them people who are somehow not capable of being effective? Not only that, because of the fact that it brings them back down to base level, and because of the fact that it returns them to being perceived as humans in the mind of humanity, well, humans are fallible. Humans screw up. Humans do stupid things. People say and do things all the time that they would normally never say under any normal circumstance, but in the height of emotion, suddenly logic goes right out the window. And when that's the case, how do you in turn justify that when you've got someone like Superman? What happens if Lois Lane dies and Superman has an emotional crisis? Well, then you run into injustice. And so that's the kind of scenario that's being presented here, is what happens when those who were deemed as infallible with the power of God suddenly become fallible and emotional. Well, then suddenly the world could be turned upside down. The world could just be left in a total state of catastrophe. And that's the whole point that Superman's making here, and that's why it works so well, is because he basically says, these are people from different countries, different walks of life that I've watched day in and day out face off against threats that most of you guys couldn't even imagine, let alone see. I've seen them achieve insurmountable things. I've seen them do things that are astronomical. I've seen men and women who can tap into nature itself. I've seen those who can use the power of animals. I've seen gods who ascend from the oceans in order to try to make peace with the surface world and literally try to bridge the gap between these two things. I've met aliens from outer space. I've met other Kryptonians where I thought I was alone. I've met all these different people who come from all these different facets of what you would call the superhero community, but at the end of the day, they're still just people. They know fear, they know love, they know hate, they know all these emotions, and because they know all these things, it's easy to be overcome by them. And that's why it's so intriguing, and that's why it's so fascinating, is because he says that was the basis behind Sanctuary. It wasn't to manipulate, it wasn't to lie, it wasn't to trick, it wasn't to be a place where they could basically say, like, I killed a person and I'm essentially performing the same act as, like, confessing to a priest, and now it can't be used against me. That's not the basis behind it. It's a place for those individuals who have powers but are effectively human to basically deal with the various torments and nightmares they've endured over the course of their entire experience in the superhero landscape. And so that's so awesome, because what it does is, again, it kind of humanizes all these different superheroes. And I've seen a few complaints here and there. It's like, oh, well, here goes DC humanizing heroes again. Well, I mean, yeah, it kind of makes sense. I mean, unless you're saying Batman's not human. So again, it's sort of an interesting concept here to basically see that kind of worked in and to kind of bring them back down. Because to me, I like heroes who are relatable. Like, I like heroes who are interesting. I mean, for all the complaints people will make about DC saying, well, here they go making heroes relatable again, there's an awful lot of arguments about how Superman sucks because he's not relatable. So I like all these different points that are kind of being made here, and it's really, really interesting. But one of the big points that's also kind of made is that Booster Gold basically says, because he's a hero who's so well versed in time travel, he understands the basis behind the rules of time travel, right? Like in DC Comics, you have a kind of set of guidelines, right? Like you've got the temporal authority, whatever it is, like basically a police force that makes sure that a person from the future doesn't get time travel technology and then start screwing up the past and totally destroying the time stream. And so one of the things Booster Gold says is that in order to verify how far back a person's gone, in order to see whether or not a person's actually time travel when they weren't supposed to, what they would do is they would take your RNA and they would compare it to your birthday. And if your RNA was off, if your RNA was not 34 years old and you're actually 34 years old, that's how they would know. And Booster Gold, basically being kind of a shady guy, has had to essentially understand this concept in order to find ways to work around it. And so when he and Blue Beetle were like investigating all these different things, what they basically discovered here is that the body of Wally West is essentially 5 days old. That something's not right. That there's something going on in this bigger picture. Things aren't really what they seem to be. Now, Tom King makes this exceedingly vague. He makes this incredibly vague, and he does that intentionally because we don't really know how this is going to go. We don't really know where this rabbit hole leads to, but it's really intriguing, and it's actually really cool because it's one of these things where, like, it's effectively Tom King saying not everything is what it seems to be. Not everything is what it appears to be. And again, like, as the story goes on, we'll essentially begin to learn more. Okay, so picking up with Heroes in Crisis Part 6, like a lot of the story that we've seen so far is kind of split into sections. And so we're going to kind of take each one of these, because what it does is it actually sort of bounces back and forth between a guy named Narc and then Harley Quinn and then Wally West. So we're going to kind of take these in segments. But with Harley Quinn, like hers is really the most straightforward, because what's ironic about this is that with Sanctuary, Poison Ivy had shown up here presumably for the sake of like getting help. But for the most part, Poison Ivy's just kind of like, I'm fine the way I am. This is really more for Harley Quinn. So it's really more that like she snuck Harley Quinn in there. which is kind of a bad guy doing what a bad guy does, I guess. But the gist behind this really seems to be more towards kind of leaning towards the idea that there really kind of appear to be some criminals out there who are just incorrigible. And the indication seems to be that Harley Quinn was perceived as being one of those criminals, that there was really no way to help her. There was no way to make her better. But the cool thing about this is that Tom King kind of hits on the idea that she's not that far gone. What she needed was the right kind of treatment. And the way this seems to kind of come about is when Poison Ivy starts helping Harley Quinn by basically creating like these manifestations of the Joker. And what they do is go through and essentially like torment the Joker and kill him, destroy him, that kind of different thing. Because that's what the Joker did to Harley Quinn. And that's one of the things to bear in mind here is that a lot of those themes that weren't necessarily hit on, that were really hit on the nose in Batman the Animated Series certainly were in the comics, that the Joker was exceedingly abusive, but Harley Quinn kept coming back due to some warped perspective of what love is supposed to be. Now, how Harley Quinn got to that point is really kind of reflective of whatever her origin story is, right? I mean, she's got one origin story in Batman the Animated Series. She's got another origin story in the actual DC Comics, and then she's got another origin story when she was rebooted in the New 52. But throughout all of those, the common themes are basically that Harley Quinn, in some form or fashion, was kind of brought up with a victim's mentality, with kind of like an abusive mentality. So it's kind of strange the way it all plays out. But again, it sort of makes sense with her character in terms of how she's progressed so far. So like literally Poison Ivy's using her vines to like kill the Joker. Like the Joker's like killing himself, basically like cutting his own throat. It's basically using these things as a means to kind of help Harley get past the kind of pain that she's experienced and stop seeing the Joker as someone that could legitimately torment her and see the Joker as somebody who's just easily killed. Because in a lot of ways, the Joker is really like an easily killable guy. The story of Harley Quinn kind of ends when the alarm bells go off, basically saying like, there's an emergency, you guys all need to make their way to the exit. Because Harley's not supposed to be there, Poison Ivy tells her, stay here, I'm gonna go see what's going on. And then of course, as we know, Poison Ivy dies. And so what we end up doing at this point is we switch over to Wally West. Now, for Wally West, it's kind of interesting here because the big torment of Wally isn't necessarily like any sort of scenario he's been put through as a hero with regards to like a villain he faced that took like an emotional toll or anything like that. It's being cut off from the world. Like that's the torment of Wally West. That when everything happened with Flashpoint and the characters were effectively rebooted, Wally West was stuck in the Speed Force. So when Barry Allen came out, when the whole reboot finished, Barry Allen had like his whole life and he was so sure of the life he lived being the right one with like Donna Troy and Dick Grayson and all those characters living their lives. They've effectively lived their lives the way they're supposed to. Wally West is suddenly being thrown in here, and because of the fact that like this huge event of Flashpoint happened and nobody remembers what happened before the events of Flashpoint, Wally's mindset, being he's one of the few who does remember, is like things aren't the way they're supposed to be. He's not married to his wife. He's not married to Linda Park. He can't find Jai and Iris, his kids. So in his mind, like the world's literally in shambles. And for a brief moment, when Barry Allen basically realized who he was and Barry Allen brought him back, it was kind of like, hey, like everything's going to go back to the way it was supposed to, only for us to find out that it's not. Now it's kind of interesting that the way Tom King does this, because in reality, Tom King doesn't really do anything to change the nature of Wally West. What he does is he uses the story to frame the perspective of Wally West in a slightly different way, that it really is just kind of a crushing situation, that there's no going back, that's kind of the fear and really the basis behind Wally West's life right now. He can't go back to the way things used to be. And that's kind of the cool thing about the Heroes in Crisis story and the nature of Wally, is because when Superman embraces him and says, hey man, like you're back, and when Nightwing embraces him and Donna Troy embraces him and Roy Harper embraces him, they keep saying like, you're back man, you're the embodiment of hope. But the question that Wally has is, how can I be the embodiment of hope if I'm hopeless? And that's kind of the cool scenario here, is things change, the world moves forward, you've got to change with the times. And so it's kind of a cool little thing, because when of course all that begins to go down, when all that begins to happen, basically like Wally, despite the fact that he's basically surrounded by the Titans, despite the fact that Superman knows who he is because Superman knows how things were before the events of Flashpoint, despite the fact that he's surrounded by like Barry Allen, Iris West, these people that essentially know who he is, it doesn't change the fact that Wally West in his entirety feels completely alone. He feels completely alone and cut off, because from his perspective, he's in a world that he doesn't belong in. And so that's what makes it kind of crazy. So again, it's really interesting, because again, like the alarm bells go off and then it all kind of comes to a head. Now again, we'll get to that point here in a second in terms of what comes next. But at this point, we jump back to a character named Narc. Now, Narc was a character who originally appeared back in 1971 by Steve Skeets, I think it was the guy who created him. But essentially, he's like an old school pre-crisis character. But essentially, like this version of his character is kind of reminiscing on how things were back in the early days of his life. And in the early days of Narc's life, he was just like a Neanderthal, right? Like he was a caveman essentially. And what had happened was that a meteorite had struck the earth, and then a fraction of that meteorite, some of the crystal composed inside, bonded itself to him and basically like jump-started his intellect, made him super smart. When that happened, of course, eventually he was frozen in ice. And then basically he was stuck there for like hundreds and thousands of years until he was eventually discovered by like the Teen Titans. Being discovered by the Teen Titans, he was essentially let loose and then like kind of joined the team for a little while, and then his fate fate was never really specified. Now, in the New 52, we ended up learning like that there was like a new version of him, but again, none of that really ties into like how his character quote unquote died according to Lilith in the pre-Flashpoint landscape. But again, at this moment right now, because of the fact that he's so intelligent, he reminisces on characters like Hobbes and Rousseau. Now, Hobbes is basically talking about Thomas Hobbes, and Thomas Hobbes was this philosopher that had this really, really dark perspective, right? Like he considered the nature of humanity to be a perpetual and permanent war of all against all. You had something called a state of nature. There was no ordered government. It was just kind of humans, really more of like what passes for nomadic tribes, just kind of making their way. But it's essentially a state of nature, no ordered government of any kind. Thomas Hobbes believed that because resources are finite, that resources basically have to be preserved. But the only way to really preserve those resources is to create what was called the Leviathan, which is essentially like an ordered government created by whatever society exists at the time. And so again, like there are a lot of other themes that go into it in terms of like abuses of power. If a king abuses his powers, it's just the way it goes. There's really not a whole lot you can do about that. I mean, you can try to overthrow the king, but a new one will take his place, and then he may be just abusive as well. It's the price you pay to maintain some kind of like order and structure in society that you can't have it all. But again, Thomas Hobbes was very dark and very, very bleak. But at the same time, when Narc is kind of talking about his life, he says there was a lot of freedom back then. Like in the early days of his life, there was a lot of freedom, that a man really just kind of lived by the sweat of his brow. That's all it was. You know, that he fought with nature in order to kind of maintain his role among nature itself. You know, and that's when he kind of begins to go into Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a philosopher who compared the modern day to the state of nature, and basically said state of nature was better because people had actual freedom. That there really is no freedom right now. There's freedom insofar as your ability to make decisions, but your ability to make decisions is predicated based on like societal structures, right? So like I'm going to tweet, but I have to make sure I don't tweet the wrong thing, otherwise I could lose my job 10 years later. I mean, it's that kind of, it's not really freedom per se. You can't say anything you want to. You can't do anything you want to. You're limited by like the rules of society, by the scope of the society that you live in. And that's really kind of what Narc hits at, is he had absolute freedom back then. That the only real rules of society, the only real rules of the world he lived in was survival of the fittest. That he needs to eat, but another Neanderthal needs to eat. And so where he tracks down the kill, another Neanderthal will run up on him and try to take it. And basically whoever's the strongest kills the other and then gets to feast on the animal they killed. That was the rule of nature. It was the law of the land. Those who were strong enough to survive are the only ones who deserve to survive. So again, it's a little bit darker, but again, like there's a lot of themes of freedom that go in there. And it's kind of interesting when you look at it that way, because Narc kind of has a point that like back in his early days, it really was just freedom. He was free to do whatever he wanted to live his life however he wanted to. There were no bounds there. There were no limits there. The only limits imposed on him were the physical limits of his body at that point in time, the limits of where he could travel in terms of what's too cold, what's too hot, and the limits in terms of what his mind could comprehend. And that was it. Everything else he could do whatever he wanted to. And imagine that kind of freedom. Imagine the freedom to go where you want, when you want, how you want, to say anything you want to. Like imagine that kind of freedom, and then compare that to the modern day and look how free you're really not. That was kind of the argument of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. You're not really as free as you believe. You're as free as you've been told. And so it's really kind of a cool comparison between these two different philosophies. But again, like, you know, the alarm bells go off, Narc ends up making his way off and basically says, hey, look, maybe I'm kind of overthinking it all. But at the same time, like that's when everything kind of begins to unfold. Again, when like all these different superheroes end up getting killed on the grounds of Sanctuary. And so that's when we basically end up finding out Booster Gold was the one who killed Wally West, and presumably Booster Gold was the one who killed everybody else. That seems to be the case here. And so it's kind of interesting, because what it sort of hits at is that when Harley Quinn had shown up there with a blood-splattered mallet, that mallet was actually her like smashing the Joker. At least it seems to be that she was killing the various duplicates of the Joker that were being made in Sanctuary as a way to basically heal her wounds. She wasn't actually going through and killing superheroes. The actual killer here seems to be Booster Gold. So again, it's pretty interesting, and it's really, I really like the direction that it's taking in terms of how the story is unfolding. Okay, so we're getting back into Heroes in Crisis in part 7, and this is one of the things that I love a lot about the Heroes in Crisis story, is it's more of like a philosophical story, right? And for some people, that doesn't really do it for them, right? Like for some people, they like action-packed stories, like fighting and the traditional comic book story kind of tale. But the way that this is done by Tom King, it's really more of like a philosophical look at heroes, right? Like it kind of removes the action to a degree. I mean, it has some in there, but it's more of just the philosophical look at things. And a lot of this, really the biggest part of the story focuses on Wally West, because in reality, like Wally West is the character that I think a lot of people were at least at the outset of DC Rebirth the most intrigued in, and even during the events of New 52, right? Like Flashpoint happened, New 52 kicked off, and then Wally West was nowhere to be found, and everybody wanted to know where like classic Wally West went. We got a rebooted version of his character, but some fans reject that, other fans embraced it, and the result was that on the whole, people were just curious where the red-haired Wally West went. And so when he came back, then it was suddenly like, okay, well then how do we make this work? And that's really been like the whole nature of his character. And even up until now, even through like Joshua Williamson's Flash run, all the way up until now, this really kind of seems to be the point where it focuses the most on like the experience of Wally after essentially having come back. Now, there are a couple of things that go on in here. There is Booster Gold, there is Harley. It's not really essential, I don't think. It may be that later on it is, and if it is, then we'll kind of come back to it. But for the most part, a lot of this focuses on Batman, Barry Allen, and then of course Wally West. And initially this kind of picks up with like Wally West's introduction into Sanctuary, the idea that he's really kind of hopeful here. And that's the cool thing about this, is that you can sort of see this transition as the story goes on. You see this kind of transition with Wally West, where he's initially very hopeful and he's very optimistic in terms of the purposes Sanctuary can serve, right? Because the idea of Sanctuary was supposed to be a place of respite, a place where like people could go, where characters could go and kind of spill their deepest, darkest secrets, or in some form or fashion offer a revelation, or at the very least cope with the things that cause them harm in order to find some measure of peace. But it's basically Wally just kind of coming to terms with the fact that he's here, and he's sort of celebrating the fact that he can kind of move past all the struggle and strife that he's endured. Again, we'll talk about that here in a second. But one of the cool things about this is that what it does, it kind of transitions over to Barry Allen and Batman. Now, remember, when it comes to Batman and Barry Allen is really kind of on a warpath because of the fact that Wally West died. That's really kind of why he's playing the role that he is in Heroes in Crisis, that you literally had Booster Gold who showed up and kind of spilled the beans that Wally West died, and then Barry just kind of lost his mind, right? And then of course Batman's investigating because it's Batman. And so from here, it jumps back into Wally West again. Now, with Wally West, the cool thing here is that as he starts to go through this, he starts talking about progress, and he starts talking about all these things that are important to him: Linda, Iris, Jai, all these individuals. But the problem is that they're all gone. And as you look through this, you kind of notice like this difference, this kind of shift. It's not a huge shift, but this kind of shift. He's not as optimistic anymore. He's not as hopeful anymore. It's only his second week, but he's not as hopeful anymore. As time passes, he seems to lose more and more hope. But the whole basis behind this is the fact that everything he knows is gone, right? Like, that's the whole thing behind Wally. Imagine, for example, that like you woke up tomorrow and like none of your family knew who you were. Everything you know, everything of value to you has vanished. No one knows who you are. Now, that's the issue that Wally West is in. Now, conventional wisdom would say, well, then just tell them. Just walk up there and just tell them. But how do you tell them that? How do you walk up to a person who, as far as they're aware, has never met you, has no idea who you are, and say, we had a family together? They're going to think you're crazy. Not only that, from the perspective of Wally West, one of the things to bear in mind is he's a tried and true hero. And so when that's the case, he kind of has to ask himself the question, is it really better off for Linda Park to know the history between herself and Wally? There's no guarantee that she'll do the same thing Iris West did. When Barry basically revealed everything to Iris and said, hey, we were supposed to be together, and when basically Iris learned everything about Wally, that, hey, like, I'm your long lost nephew, and basically like I've been stuck in the Speed Force and all that, there's no guarantee that Linda would react the same way as Iris. Where Iris embraced Wally, Linda could rebuke him. Would Wally be able to withstand that? And would it be better off for Linda, or is it better to just kind of leave her be? And so from here, again, it kind of shifts back to Batman and to Barry, and they're literally running through like all the safe houses that Booster Gold and that Ted Cord Blue Beetle usually stay at. And it's kind of a funny little exchange here. Like, Batman's like, hey man, you could just use the Bat Radio. Like, instead of like running all over the place and then running back every time he visits somewhere, run to Australia, run back, run to Berlin, run back, you can just use the Bat Radio and tell me you haven't found anything. And Barry's like, yeah, but like I'm faster than the Bat Radio. And Batman's like, well, I mean, I'm not so sure about that, but I guess if it's done on the right frequencies, I could be wrong. For the first time that I'm aware of in DC Comics, Batman admits that he could be wrong. But, kind of going into Wally West, getting into his second week here, this is really, really cool, because what it does is it kind of refreshes, I guess really Wally's kind of origin story. It's basically explaining everything about his life. And it's kind of like, hey, look, I was a hero since I was a teenager. I modeled myself after Barry Allen. Barry Allen died and I became the new Flash. But the cool thing about this is Tom King kind of relies on us as the reader to sort of know these little tidbits of what kind of goes on behind the scenes, right? Like, you had Barry Allen as the Flash, who ran all the way up until Crisis on Infinite Earths, and Wally West was Kid Flash. And then Barry Allen died during Crisis on Infinite Earths, or at least he was believed he died. And then during the events of Final Crisis, it was revealed that he was stuck in the Speed Force. But for all intents and purposes, post-Crisis, Barry was dead. And so during that time, Wally West stepped into the role of becoming the new Flash. And in the early stories under Mike Baron, it was all about Wally West basically being under the shadow of Barry. Can he ever truly be as good as Barry? Can he ever really be the great kind of Flash superhero that Barry Allen was? Constantly comparing himself to Barry Allen. It wasn't until Mike Baron left the title and Mark Waid took over that suddenly it turned into, okay, let's start focusing on the expansion of Wally. It was a natural progression. Once Wally had kind of stepped into his role as being the Flash, accepted his role as a hero, then we started getting stories like Terminal Velocity. We started getting stories like the return of Barry Allen, which was the basically post-Crisis origin for Eobard Thawne, the Reverse Flash. We started getting like all these different expansions on the nature of Wally, and then him growing, I guess him kind of moving on further, marrying Linda Park, who I think was a reporter at the time, eventually having Jai and Iris, being involved involved in Infinite Crisis, Barry Allen actually coming back, during like the original Flash Rebirth event. It's kind of cool with all these little things, but Tom King kind of relies on us. That's one of the reasons why it's sort of a little bit of a goodie here, is because for somebody who's new, is okay, cool. It's him doing his origin. For those who have been part of the Flash mythos for a long time, they can kind of look at this and say, okay, I understand where he's coming from, because like here are all the things that Wally West has been through over the course of his life as a hero. And that's why it's interesting, because what this does is it kind of really allows us to sort of expand and build on his character and like the depths of struggle and strife that he's been through all this time. And so when this happens, when suddenly like after all the things that he's endured, all the loss that he's endured, to in turn come back from the Speed Force and find out that no one knows who he is except for Barry and the Titans, his wife doesn't know who he is, and his kids are missing, it's a crushing experience. And so as he goes through here, one of the things I want to kind of do is I want to jump back to the very, very beginning of the story, because what this did is it kind of gave us this poem that Wally was sort of musing over. And what he says is that in the beginning, when he and Linda Park first got married, she read this poem off to him. It was kind of like her vow to him. And what he says is that this poem that she read was really more about like death and rebirth. It was about sometimes we lose things, but we can always get those things back. It's only how hard it is that we basically work for it. And it's kind of cool, because what he says is like, Narc, a character that we talked about in the last video, kind of explained it to him, and said that it's all about creation. It's all about making things. It's not necessarily about literally making things, but about how love makes things. That essentially it was really kind of a poem of hope that Wally West still has the chance to speak to Linda Park. He still has the chance to get her back. And by virtue of doing that, tracking down and then of course getting his kids. But at the same time that he does this, he basically snaps his fingers, creates a crack of lightning, and basically like brings back Poison Ivy. He essentially resurrects her from the dead. Now, the cool thing about this is one of the important elements to remember, is that Tom King's not pulling this out of his backside, right? Like on the surface, it would be easy to assume that. When it comes to Poison Ivy, remember, she's part of the green. She's basically she's a plant elemental is really what she is. That was one of the things that was established about her through Swamp Thing. That you had like Swamp Thing, so you had the red, which is people's ability to basically kind of commune with the animal side of the world, more or less, or I guess the animal side of the universe, because they can kind of expand that beyond just the planet Earth. But then there's also the rot, which is basically everything dead, more or less. And then there's the green, which is plant life. And so while Poison Ivy's physical form would die, her spiritual essence would essentially become part of the green, which means at any point she can be brought back. And that's exactly what Wally does. He resurrects her from the dead. And it's kind of a cool thing, because initially we thought that Poison Ivy was going to be gone forever, but Tom King explicitly told us in the beginning of Heroes in Crisis on Twitter and various forms of social media, they're not going to stay dead forever. There's no reason they would. That the story's designed to be self-contained. It's designed to be a set of events that take place and then effectively end with things kind of being returned to the status quo. And that's why it's so cool, is because for everything we see here, while there is the caveat that essentially none of it really seems to matter, there's also the benefit that at the end of it all, there could be after effects. There could be things that kind of continue on from the events of Heroes in Crisis. But that's kind of where this big revelation comes from, is because while Wally is talking to Poison Ivy, what he says is, I hurt you. I was supposed to help you and I didn't. I was supposed to be a hero and I didn't. In a time when you needed me, I basically let you die. And the reason why was because I wasn't really being a hero, and I apologize for that, because you're gonna have to see what comes next. And when she says what? She says, my death. You're going to have to watch me die. And that's the crazy thing, because essentially Wally West is in the present watching himself die, presumably coming from the future or the past. We don't know. Okay, so originally I was not going to cover this, at least not right now, right? Like the most anticipated comic book movie, and I would argue the most anticipated movie of all time, is coming out like tonight. Why would I talk about anything but Endgame? That kind of baffled me, right? Like Endgame's coming out. It's like, yeah, Rob, I know Endgame's coming out, and it's the one thing that everybody's talking about. Can you talk about Spawn? And it was like, no. Absolutely not. But then like I read Heroes in Crisis 8 and I was like, oh my God, like I have to cover this, because dude, here's the thing, man. Dude, Tom King. All right, those of you guys who don't like Tom King, you're wrong. And I'm gonna tell you why you're wrong. So this whole thing was like a giant mystery, right? Like we didn't know who actually killed everybody at Sanctuary and Heroes in Crisis, like at least not in the beginning. But then it was revealed that it was Harley Quinn, but then it was also revealed that it was Booster Gold. And the question was, well, then who was it that did it, right? Because if we saw Harley Quinn kill everyone in the beginning, and then we saw Booster Gold kill everyone, then who actually killed everyone? It was a great big huge mystery. And so what this does is it basically picks up with like Wally West. And it's the coolest thing, because what he basically says is like, this is my confession. And I was just like, wow, like right out of the gate. Like it's nuts. Like I am big. See, this is why I like slow builds, right? Like a lot of people out there don't really like slow builds. They like, I want the story told in 3 issues or less, which doesn't give you enough time to really build anything up. But slow builds are awesome because the payoff is usually worth it. And like, this is one of those instances where it was definitely worth it, because when you go through this, he starts like literally Wally starts talking about how like he'd been there at Sanctuary for a few weeks, and he was there to recover and all that kind of cool stuff. But the funny thing about this is he starts to talk about how he looked at himself in relation to everybody else. And it's one of the things that we weren't initially made aware of. What Wally basically says here is that with the nature of Sanctuary being what it was, that all these different people were there to basically cope with the struggles that they'd endured. Now, we knew that, right? Like, we knew the basis behind Sanctuary was that it was supposed to be a place of healing. And maybe your method of healing was just punching, virtual reality drones. And maybe your method of healing was just meditation. Whatever the case was, all these different heroes, and even some of the villains to a degree who were trying to reform, were going through Sanctuary for the purpose of healing themselves, sort of healing their minds, healing their spirits, and so on and so forth, so they could go forward having dealt with all this trauma. But for the most part, what we weren't really told, and what really seems to be hit on the head here, is that they were all in isolation. And it's kind of interesting because Tom King sort of made that ambiguous, right? Like, all we really saw with regards to the various characters and heroes in Crisis is like what they were doing to heal. We didn't see what they were doing in their downtime. We didn't know if they were all like just kind of hanging out and mingling and talking, and if sort of socializing was kind of the healing method, which would have made sense. Because if you were Poison Ivy and you were trying to like get to a better version of yourself, then what better way to do that than to spend time hanging out with heroes, people who normally go through and save others. But in fact, all these individuals were in a compartmentalized space, that they were basically all isolated from one another. Now, again, that allowed for anonymity. It allowed for them to be able to basically function without anybody knowing what their confessions were or what they were doing to heal, which provided a lot more privacy, and it basically allowed them to operate with impunity in a small space without any real consequence for what it was that they were doing. But when Wally started looking at this, and when he started kind of focusing on himself, the conclusion that he came to was that he was crazy. Well, the issue here was that when he looked at Sanctuary, it wasn't a place where like all these people were going to heal. In the mind of Wally West, it was all just a front. Like, literally everything going on in Sanctuary was designed for the purpose of making him feel like he wasn't that bad. And so what this means is that for the most part, when he looks at all the other people, they're basically actors, that they're there just to basically put on the show and make it all seem legit. And so he started asking these questions. Why is it anonymous? Why is it that nobody really knows what anybody else is doing? And he essentially just started to like feed into his own ideology, right? And that's kind of the cool thing here. That's one of the things that Tom King hits on, right? Like, for whatever reason, we will develop an ideology, right? And then where the thought process used to be, in a previous age of humanity, where the thought process used to be, here is an opinion I have, let me find facts that either, confirm this opinion or conflict with this opinion. And if the facts that I find conflict with my opinion, then maybe it's time for me to reorganize my opinion. In this day and age, it's, I have an opinion, now let me find the facts to support it and ignore the facts that don't. And that's exactly what happened with Wally. Wally started going through and he developed this ideology, he's crazy. So then he started going through and looking at all the information and would either twist it and skew it or would ignore it if it didn't support his perception. And he would basically say like, this is all the information that shows that I'm a crazy person. This is all the information that shows that like all these things are messed up. And what he really kind of says here is that in his mind, that maybe some of it had to do with Linda Park. And the reason why is he says like, for the most part, he was isolated and alone. And that's the interesting thing about this, because when you look at Wally here, while he does do something pretty screwed up, in a lot of ways he's a victim. Because when you look at Wally post DC Rebirth, for the most part, aside from the Titans, there was nobody really there to kind of guide him and how to interact with Linda. Barry did to a degree, but the problem is that Barry was, he really took kind of a cowardly role, right? It's like, hey, Wally, you should go and talk to Linda. And Wally's response was, no, I don't want to. And then Barry said, okay, and then walked away. What Wally needed was to have his hand forced. What Wally needed was to be made to go talk to Linda Park, because Wally didn't know that's what he needed. And that's something that Barry should have been able to pick up on, because Barry was his mentor. And so following this, we see one of the coolest set of events unfold in the history of Wally West's character. So what Wally ends up doing is he basically sits down and he says, okay, I have to find out whether or not this is a show or not. I have to find out whether or not any of this is real. But the problem with Sanctuary, according to Wally, is that all the confessions that are made are literally split into like a billion different pieces. They're fragmented all over the place and then just kind of scattered out into wherever it is that they happen to go. But Wally is the fastest man alive. And so Wally's like, okay, well, I'm just going to grab all the pieces and grab all these little digital bytes and bring them back together again. And that's what he did. Wally West was the one who recompiled everybody's confessions. He's the one that basically brought it all back together, and then he watched all the confessions. And the issue is that when he did that, it broke him, because he was literally watching nothing but pain and suffering for however long it took him to watch. And it basically warped and screwed up his mind. And the result was that it essentially kind of broke him on a mental level. Now, following this, he basically races out of the house to catch his breath. And then what he does is he talks about the Speed Force. And he says that with the Speed Force, people look at it and they say, yeah, the Speed Force is so cool. You've got an accelerated healing factor. You can time travel. You can travel to other dimensions if you vibrate the right way. You can do all kinds of really awesome things. But Wally says that like there's a huge drawback. And a huge drawback is that you're essentially taking taking your portion of a multiversal source of energy and keeping it confined into yourself. And if it were to explode out of you, what would happen? And that's what happens here. That when Wally's trying to regain his composure, when he's watching all this pain and suffering replay in his head, when he triggers an alarm by messing with the computer systems and everybody comes filing out, all this energy just kind of lets loose. He snaps for a brief second. And when that happens, all these people in Sanctuary are killed. And so the question is, what does Wally do? Because he just basically killed everyone. What does Wally do after this? He constructs a plan. He basically frames Booster Gold and Harley Quinn. What he essentially does is that because Booster and Harley were the last two who were in there, they're the last two who left, that what he essentially did is he messed with their VR systems so that when they thought they were leaving, they were actually walking back into the VR system itself. And then he in turn modified Sanctuary so that Harley Quinn saw Booster Gold kill everybody, including Wally West, and Booster Gold saw Harley Quinn kill everybody, including Wally West. And so following that, he ran 5 days into the future. Like after they were done, he ran 5 days into the future, brought himself back, and literally had this conversation. He placed a fake body. Basically, like he engineered an entire crime scene. And he did this because he was with Barry Allen for decades, right? For like at least 20 years of his life. He knows exactly how Barry Allen thinks. And with Barry Allen being the CSI, the crime scene investigator that the Justice League would inevitably call in, the best one in the world, he knew exactly what Barry would look for, and he knew exactly what Barry would miss. He also knew what Batman would follow up with, because remember, Flash has been on team, or Wally West has been on teams with Batman before. And so while he's not the best person to know exactly how Batman thinks, what he does know is how Batman functions as a detective. Wally West tricked Barry Allen and tricked Batman into believing that he actually died. And then what he did is he basically set up frames. He killed everyone and lied about it. And so following that, like he basically said, like, I had 5 days. I had 5 days to sit down and to create this confession. Wally West killed everyone, faked a crime scene, tampered with evidence, framed Harley Quinn and Booster Gold, all for the purpose of trying to find a way to basically escape a murder that he made and try to find a way to do something right to make up for what it was that he did wrong. And the only conclusion he could come to, the only thing that he could figure out, the only thing that he believed he could do right in order to correct what it was that he did wrong was to confess, to send this confession directly to Lois Lane. And it's crazy because what this basically means now is that like Wally West is a murderer. Now, given the circumstance in terms of how it unfolded, one of the things that you guys will usually always notice when it comes to superheroes in various comic books, superheroes in Marvel, superheroes in DC, is they usually get a pass, right? Like that was one of the best lines of Secret Empire. To kind of sidetrack here from Heroes in Crisis, that was one of the best parts of Secret Empire when evil Captain America was talking to good Captain America, that literally what evil Captain America said was like, hey, like I'm not one of your Avenger friends, right? Like I'm not Thor, I'm not the Incredible Hulk, I don't get a pass. It's one of these things where like I'll end up having to do time for what I did. With Wally, it's something akin to that, right? Like Wally is a hero, and so the result is that he'll be given the benefit of the doubt. If this was any other villain out there, immediately he would have been put on trial, probably sent to Arkham or sent to some other prison, Belle Reve, thrown into the Suicide Squad. Like who knows what would have happened to them, but they certainly would not get the benefit of the doubt, right? Like if the Joker had done this, or if like Harley Quinn had done this, like they would have immediately been thrown in there. But with Wally, it's like, well, but I mean, he's a good guy though, so like we got to give him the benefit of the doubt. I mean, sure, he did a really bad thing, but like we like him though, so like it's okay. Like that's literally what it'll turn into. And it's so intriguing because it basically kind of throws into the idea of like, what happens to Wally next? Where do we go from here? Wally is a confessed killer. He confessed to his crime. What follows after this? One of the best comics I've read in a long time. I love Heroes in Crisis. It's absolutely amazing. Okay, so you guys have been asking for it, so we are finally covering the conclusion to Heroes in Crisis. Also, FYI, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, we're covering Dark Phoenix Saga, so that we can have that out for the weekend. And then we jump back into your regularly scheduled programming, which is basically almost everything coming out from Marvel, because we have a lot of catching up to do. But with Heroes in Crisis number 9, this basically answers the question that everybody's been asking: why did Wally do what he did? How did it all unfold? What's going on, right? Because with Heroes in Crisis, like we have had questions answered, but it's been kind of cloak and dagger and kind of murky, and it's kind of been like half answers. And so it's just sort of like, all right, like we need a definitive explanation to all of this stuff. And so what this does is it initially picks up with the arrival of Batgirl, of Booster Gold, of Blue Beetle, and Harley Quinn. Now, remember, these four have been just essentially like figuring everything out, or at least trying to figure everything out. And under normal circumstances, we would assume Batman would be the one to arrive to the conclusion about everything. But remember, Harley Quinn and Booster Gold were the ones who were on the scene. And so the result is that they actually kind of have an insight into what's going on that nobody else in the Justice League has. At the same time, they were believed to have been the killers. And so they were essentially underground. And so what you had was Batwoman and Blue Beetle, who basically ran up on them. Now, of course, Batwoman running up on Harley Quinn was kind of pairing the two together, even though they've never really been like direct enemies. Harley Quinn's more of like a Batman enemy, but also kind of an enemy of the Bat family, right? But like in terms of who she comes into conflict most, is Batman. That's kind of what we expect from her character, really alongside the Joker, or even by herself when she's on a team with Gotham City Sirens. But the fact remains that with Booster Gold and Blue Beetle, again, this makes sense, right? For the people who have been reading DC for a while, Booster Gold and Blue Beetle go way back, like they're exceedingly good friends. And so when Booster Gold shows up on the doorstep of Ted Kord and says, "Hey man, I didn't do this, you have to believe me," Ted Kord's response is, "Okay, then let's figure out who did." And that's kind of why we have all these guys here. And so when Harley shows up, they're immediately met by the arrival of like Poison Ivy. And this is kind of a cool thing. It's actually a cool little moment here, because when it comes to Harley Quinn, while we do see the human side of her in the sense that like she feels emotion, she cries, she loves, things like that, it's usually accompanied by like insanity or some crazy set of circumstances. We very rarely ever get to see Harley Quinn just be a tried and true person, right? And it's one of the things that we tend to forget, that like at the end of the day, despite her various escapades with the Joker, and even with Poison Ivy, despite her dealings with the Suicide Squad and so on, Harley Quinn is still, for the most part, a rational person. She's crazy, but she's not like Joker crazy, right? She's not like off the deep end, never to return to sanity. And the funny thing about this is that Poison Ivy is kind of her anchor to her sanity, right? It's like the one person that keeps her from like falling over the edge. The two have been romantically involved. They were a couple up until the point when like Poison Ivy basically died. Now, this is also a very big revelation here that's really kind of built on from the last issue, from the last couple issues, and is kept going by Tom King. And it's basically the idea that Poison Ivy is essentially immortal, right? Like she has, like what she does is something akin to like Voldemort and the Horcruxes, right? Like so long as those Horcruxes exist, Voldemort would always come back. The idea behind this is that with Poison Ivy, a part of herself was put into a flower, and then that flower was planted, of course, by Wally West 5 days after she died. And what that means is that so long as she puts an essence of herself into some part of the green, then she can always basically remanifest. She can return. Now, of course, for those of you guys who are coming into this brand new, the green is just kind of a colloquial name for like nature, more or less, insofar as like plant life, right? You have the red, which is animals, and then you have the rot, which is the death of all things, more or less, like death itself to a degree, like rotting, decaying, that kind of a thing. The gist behind this is that with Poison Ivy being part of the green, it means that she's literally part of nature, right? Like she's on par with Swamp Thing. And so basically by establishing this again, Tom King says like so long as a part of her essence is tapped into the green, meaning like it's in a flower or a plant or something like that, and it's reconnected to the green, reconnected to like nature itself, to the plant aspect of this world or any other, then what it means is that she can basically reconstitute her physical form. And then of course it seems as though she has all of her memories intact. She recalls Harley Quinn. She knows the two of them were together. It's a pretty cool little thing. And it really kind of like adds on to the existing nature of Poison Ivy, right? We always kind of knew to a degree there was an aspect of immortality there. We just didn't really know how far it went. Of course, this is when it switches over to Wally West. And this is kind of a cool thing because you sort of have like Batwoman, you have Harley, you have Poison Ivy, Booster Gold, and Ted Kord, who are just sort of watching these two Wally Wests, encounter one another. And it's because Wally West feels totally alone. And this is when the huge explanation comes. This is when it's all basically revealed. That what we find out here is that when Wally had pieced together all these little bits of information, right? Like these little tidbits of confessions and so on, when he experienced like this huge influx of like pain and suffering from all these heroes, he cracked. And of course, we know that led to him just kind of letting off the Speed Force power and killing everybody in the vicinity. That part had already been explained. What comes next is this idea that in Wally's mind, because he had killed all these people, what he needed to do was something that would basically right the wrong. He needed an equally good thing to match the equally bad thing. And so what he ended up doing was running 5 days into the future, grabbing himself and then killing himself, bringing it back and then dropping it off. And of course, as we know, that would spare him 5 days. But the logic behind his actions is what we didn't entirely know. His initial indication was, well, I'll just run back in time and stop myself from blowing up. But as he points out with Barry Allen and the Flashpoint event, we don't know what ramification that would cause, right? I mean, for Barry, it was keeping his mom alive, right? Like it was saving the life of his mom. And that changed the entire universe. Something that small that seemed, for the most part, to be confined strictly to Barry, right? Like it wasn't like he saved Krypton from blowing up and he saved Batman's parents, and he prevented Joker from being thrown into like the vat of chemicals at Ace Chemical Plant, and he stopped Two-Face from being splashed with acid. It's not like he did all those things, right? It's just he saved his mom's life, and that fundamentally altered the entirety of the universe. Now, Doomsday Clock is kind of hitting on that and saying, well, it really may have been more Manhattan than like Barry Allen, but at the end of the day, the actions of Barry fundamentally changed the way the universe was organized and structured. And what Wally was doing is he was looking at that and saying, okay, all Barry did was save his mom's life. Now we're talking about me going back in time and preventing the deaths of a whole bunch of heroes. We have no idea what impact that would have on the universe. So he said, okay, that's done. Then the question became, okay, then what good can I do in order to fix this? And that's why he basically compiled all that information, all the confessions, released it to Lois Lane, and then had her dump it to the press. It forced the hand of Superman. Is because what it did is it forced Superman to come out as like the world's premier hero, right? Like the one hero everybody looks up to, and the one hero that pretty much everyone trusts came out and said, guys, what you've seen is real. It's not a dupe, it's not a trick, it's not some CGI Adobe After Effects. It's us as heroes confessing our darkest moments, the things that we regret the most, the mistakes we've made, and basically saying like, we're humans, we screw up, we feel pain and all that kind of stuff. We don't show you because you have to look up to us. And what are we if we're emotional, if we feel pain and we feel suffering and we want to give up sometimes and we do bad things? If we're not the people you've built us up to be, then we're nothing different than you. And if you can't rely on us to save the world, then you have to rely on yourselves to save the world, which can lead to absolute anarchy, because then suddenly everybody becomes a vigilante. You need us to be heroes and you need to see us as heroes. Therefore, we could not let you see us as anything but that. That's why we had Sanctuary. That's why we kept everything hidden from you. But Superman going out, stepping out and revealing all that basically meant that like the world sees heroes as people. And so it's kind of a fun thing, kind of an interesting thing, because what this does is it taps into Wally, and it really kind of changes the entire dynamic of like Heroes in Crisis, because now it's no longer Heroes in Crisis. Now it's the crisis of Wally West, right? Like I was at Denver Comic-Con this past weekend, and I was talking to Sal, and he and I were running over like what we thought about Heroes in Crisis, and he made that good point. He's like, it's the crisis of Wally West, because when you look at Wally as a character, and that's why this is so cool, when you look at Wally as a character, all he's known since the events of Rebirth is loss, right? Like that's all he's known. Before the events of Flashpoint, before the events of Rebirth, that Wally West had Jai and Iris, he had his kids, he had Linda, he had his family, he had everything that he ever wanted, right? I mean, in a lot of ways, he lived the perfect life. That was the cool thing about Wally, and that's why so many fans loved him so much, right? Like Crisis on Infinite Earths happens, Barry Allen basically dies, or at least was supposed to have died, ends up joining the Speed Force, and he's gone for the next 20 years. This sets the stage for Wally to basically become the new Flash, and he spends the first little bit of it under the shadow of Barry, and then finally steps out of that shadow and says, I can be my own hero. Then he starts doing things like tapping into the Speed Force. He starts doing things like mainlining the Speed Force. He starts becoming the fastest of all the speedsters. He starts developing a new set of powers that not even Barry had. And then it comes a point where he basically marries the reporter Linda Park. Then he has Jai, then he has Iris. There was a point in time right before the events of Flashpoint when Wally had it all. He had everything he ever needed. He had friends, he had family, the whole 9 yards. And then Flashpoint happens and it's all gone in the blink of an eye. Everything he knows is gone. He encounters Dr. Manhattan. We know that from the events of Doomsday Clock. He tries to stop Dr. Manhattan. Manhattan pushes him back into the Speed Force, and Wally's stuck back there again. Eventually, he makes his way out when Barry finally realizes who he is, only to come back to the real world and realize the only people who seem to recall him are Wally, maybe a couple of the heroes, and like the Titans, and that's it. But the people who mean the most to him, his children, he doesn't know where they are. His wife doesn't know who he is. He's lost everything. And so in this moment, when he basically goes to like confess the things he's struggling with, when he can find a brief moment of reprieve, he kills everyone with his Speed Force powers. It's like Wally can't do anything but screw up, right? Like ever since the events of Flashpoint, he's just out of sync with the way things are supposed to be, that he can't do anything right. And that's the struggle of Wally West, is he went from being the hero to a guy who can't do anything right. And that's what's so crushing, is because ultimately he feels totally alone. And so in this moment, they're kind of stuck in a recursive time loop, right? Because the question is, if this all kind of repeats the same way, right? Like Wally runs into the past or runs into the future 5 days, he grabs that future version of himself, he brings it back, kills him, drops the body off, and then everybody thinks that Wally's dead, and that buys him the 5 days in order to bring together all the confessions and then give it to Lois Lane, who dumps it to the press, and Superman has to talk. If it always plays out that way, then how do you break that loop? Now, this is where Tom King kind of just, I wouldn't say screws the pooch, but certainly takes the story in a direction where it seems to kind of take away from the impact of everything. Because then what you end up having is Booster Gold, who chimes up and says, hey, just run to the future and just get a clone of yourself, and then like kill the clone, bring it back, drop the body off, and then you're fine. You don't have to kill yourself 5 days in the future. And so like, that's it. It's such an easy way out. To be honest, it's such an easy way out. But that's kind of the funny thing, is because if you look at Heroes in Crisis as a traditional superhero story, then yes, that ending sucks and it ruins the whole thing. But if you look at it for what it's supposed to be, which is a deconstruction of Wally West, it's not about the steps that Wally takes in order to win the day. It's about what's going on with Wally. How does he view the world? If you look at it through those eyes, the entire nature of the story changes. And I think that's where a lot of people struggled. I think a lot of people kind of went into this because DC built it that way, so you really can't fault them for it. But a lot of people went into this like, it's a great big huge event, and it's a huge story, and like all kinds of crazy things are going to happen. DC didn't really build it as a deconstruction of Wally. DC built it as like, this is the next big event, and it's like, okay. And then you get into it and you realize this doesn't quite work the way it's supposed to. Now, the thing about this is kind of the cool moment. The thing about this is that Wally kind of sits down and says, okay, so I've done this, right? Like I went to the future, I grabbed a clone, I dropped it off, I killed him, and that's the body they discover. Done and done. The recursive time loop is closed. Things can move forward. There's still the question of what happens to Wally? What goes on now? Because Wally killed people, and then he lied about it. He framed Booster Gold and Harley Quinn, and then he forced Superman's hand to dump a bunch of information that really probably shouldn't have been dumped in the first place. So what we're talking about here is is a guy who engaged in murder and espionage. So like, what do you do with a guy like that? Well, of course, Wally ends up being taken to prison and just kind of dropped off in a cell. Now, it's sort of left open-ended by Tom King in the sense that like Wally's there, but we don't really know what comes next. I imagine that question will be answered in Joshua Williamson's Flash, right? Like Joshua Williamson will probably pick up from that and go from there. Either that, or Williamson will ignore it in its entirety, and it'll be like Heroes in Crisis never happened, and that'll just be the end of it. I don't know how you treat the story like it never happened. If it was confined strictly to Wally, and he basically managed to open the time loop and close it, and no one knew about it, then sure, you could just kind of sweep this under the rug and say, Heroes in Crisis never happened, I don't know what you're talking about, and call it a day. But like the confessions of the superheroes being blasted out to the world, you can't really sweep that under the rug. There's no real like coming back from that. But at the end of the day, again, Heroes in Crisis, like I said, if you look at it for what it is, right, like the way it was designed to be viewed, then it's a beautifully done story. But the issue is that a lot of folks were kind of let in under the belief that it was a big Crisis crossover kind of Grand Poobah event, and that was it. So I don't know. I mean, I'm curious. What do you guys think? I'm curious what your opinions are, because I'm sure they're going to vary. I'm sure there are going to be people who are going to be like, Heroes in Crisis sucked, and there are going to be people who are like, Heroes in Crisis was amazing. So I'm curious what your all's response is, what your all's thought is. I enjoyed it, but again, I think the ending kind of took away from what could have been a great story, even with it being a deconstruction of Wally. But nonetheless, let me know what you guys think. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, then make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.